Welcome to today's session on Introduction to Cognitive Psychology. Now, like the previous session where we had an introduction to school counseling, this is going to be a brief introduction only to ensure that you have an idea of why we're looking at cognitive psychology. So, what we are basically going to be looking at in the slides to come is what exactly is cognitive psychology and what are the domains that come within cognitive psychology and how is it significant, or what is the importance of studying or understanding cognitive psychology, right? So let's begin. Now, what is cognitive psychology? If I were to answer that question and if I were to use the most simple terms to explain that, it would be that it is the scientific study of how people perceive, learn, remember, and think about information. Now, I may be wrong in saying this, but most often than not, we end up using the word cognition and cognitive, and generally, it's in reference to thinking or the way a person thinks about information or the way a person decides to do something, right? So, if we believe that cognition has to do with thinking, then how do all of these other factors come into the role of cognitive psychology, whether it be perceiving, learning, remembering, right? So let's take a look at how cognitive psychology came into the picture. Now, I don't want to really go in depth into the history of cognitive psychology, but nonetheless, just a brief idea of how cognitive psychology came into existence. So, we'll touch upon the basic ideas of where the roots of cognitive psychology lie, and moving ahead into time and coming to the present as to what is the current status of where cognitive psychology is and what are we currently studying. Yes. Now, if we look at how cognitive psychology came into existence, we'd definitely have to go back into its most philosophical roots, where we're actually talking about Aristotle and Plato. So, Plato and Aristotle. Now, if we consider the significant amount of emphasis that Plato played or Plato laid on being logical and being a rationalist, right? And if we look at what we mean by being rational and reasoning information, we'd realize that this is something what we tend to do even now. So we're saying that we're thinking, but what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to deduce and come to a conclusion or make an inference based on the information that we are provided. So from our philosophical roots, we could see that Plato had a very strong role to play, and so did Aristotle. Aristotle did believe or did give more emphasis to the heart, or let's say he did emphasize on the role of mental imagery. But even then, we'd see that our philosophical roots have moved on from being just about rationalizing to being about our experiences and our own observations that help us understand the information that we come across. So empiricists, as we would like to generally put it, tend to believe or give more emphasis to our own experiences and our ability to observe our surroundings and then comprehend the information that we are being provided with. Now, moving on from our philosophical roots, and if we'd look at how we've moved ahead in time into structuralism, both of these, whether be it rationalist or empiricism, both have played a very strong role in defining a foundation towards, or defining a foundation and moving towards cognitive psychology. Now, coming to what exactly is structuralism. Now, in structuralism, and it began with William Wundt, and it began in around 1879, 1880s, where William Wundt actually gave a lot of emphasis on introspection. Yes, and I'm sure most of you know what introspection actually is, right? So, when he gave a lot of emphasis on introspection, he was more interested in understanding the structure of behavior, in understanding the what of behavior rather than understanding the why of behavior. Yes, so when he questioned the what of behavior, he wanted to understand what kind of behavior existed, right? So he utilized the method of introspection, and one of his students was actually responsible for formulating the term structuralism that came into existence. So, yes, he believed in objectively observing. He did believe in trying to be objective as much as possible. But all of us know that with introspection, there is very little room for objectivity, because the term introspection, as it suggests, is where we introspect in terms of how we feel, or how I think I feel about a certain situation, or whether what I'm doing is right or wrong. And therein lies the subjectivity that we all talk about. So, William Wundt and his students conducted a lot of experiments, and they tried to understand the water behavior. But eventually, people were more interested in understanding the why of behavior, right? And when we say why, and that's how functionalism really came into existence. So people were really interested in wanting to know why we behave the way we did, right? And the focus then moved into understanding how the mind worked, why it worked the way it did, and also towards our understanding of consciousness. And as people, or as researchers moved into being or studying more about the function of our mind, they started focusing, or their research methods started focusing more on real life setting studies. Yes, and with that, or while we see that the function of behavior and why, or what caused the kind of behavior sorry, was being studied, you'd see that it actually paved the path to behaviorism, to understanding more objective data. Now, eventually, behaviorism did emerge, and yes, all of us know that the whole school of behaviorism is very popular in and by itself. But what actually came out of functionalism and moved on to behaviorism became a much more, if I had to put it, a much more rigid way of looking at information. So when we understand what behaviorism means, is we are basically saying that behaviorists propagated looking at observable behavior and trying to make it as objective as possible, and in that sense, they started completely rejecting introspection as a technique in understanding our own cognitions and our mind. So, emphasis was laid on what was observable and what was noticeable, and only because they believe that this is the most objective way of studying behavior or studying why people behaved the way they did. Yes, and yes, you have Skinner and Pavlov and all of the behavioral researchers who at that point started doing the laboratory experiments. But we also had a few others, like, for example, Tolman, who brought about the emergence of something slightly different. So, although Tolman is considered to be a behaviorist, he also laid the foundation of understanding cognitive psychology in its true sense. Now, if if you all might remember the experiment that Tolman did with rats in the maze, and he's had different variations of the rat in a maze, but nonetheless, the whole concept or the whole idea of cognitive maps came into existence with this very experiment that Tolman conducted. And the basic premise behind these experiments was that Tolman believed that all behavior was directed towards some type of goal. And to understand behavior, we need to understand the goal. And hence, through this, you are able to understand the way people think. Yes? And that was the school of behaviorism. Now, while this development was happening, you'd also notice that the Gestalt psychology also became popular around the time, but the only difference being that the Gestalt psychology laid more emphasis on a completely different concept within cognitive psychology, that being perception. And all of us know about the whole principles, the Gestalt principles that help us understand how we tend to organize and categorize information, and how we tend to store information, and how we tend to perceive the information that is provided to us, and how that is very subjective in nature, because the way one person perceives a certain information might not be the same similar or the same manner in which the second person perceives the information. So yes, then we have Gestalt psychology also, which contributed towards the foundation of cognitive psychology. Now, as we move ahead towards understanding how cognitive psychology came into existence, and although we'd look at our philosophical roots, we'd look at how the behaviorists played an important role and the Gestalt psychology played an important role, we also understand, or cognitive psychology also draws a lot from developmental psychology. And that's how developmental psychology comes under as one of the domains, and you will see that in the next few slides that we come across. So, how exactly does developmental psychology contribute to cognitive psychology would be a question that you would consider. Now, the whole reason why developmental psychology plays a role here is because throughout the whole human development, throughout our whole lifespan, all of us go through changes. All of us are changing, developing, and these changes tend to bring about changes in the way we see things, in the way we perceive things, and all of these experiences that we have mold us into the individual that we are. And it is always an ongoing process and will remain an ongoing process till death. Yeah. So, all of the experiences that we have accumulated and everything that has molded us into the individual that we are also plays a role in defining how we think, how we perceive, how we learn, how we store information, how we make decisions, and that's where we want to consider, or we want to understand, the role that the developmental psychology plays or contributes into cognitive psychology. Yes? And the last thing that we're looking at, and that would look that would be the current condition of how we're looking at cognitive psychology. So yes, we're considering how we think. Yes, we're considering how we solve problems. Yes, we're considering how we make decisions. But what we're also considering is, how are we utilizing any of learned processes? How are we communicating it? How are we interpreting it? I'm so sorry. Yes. So what we're looking at then is that our focus in cognitive psychology is moving away, not completely away, but also has a lot to do with language, also has a lot to do with communication. So our linguistics, how we acquire or how we learn languages, how we communicate the ideas that we have, and how are we capable of efficiently doing all of these processes or engaging in all of these processes. So, in the current times, cognitive psychology or studies within cognitive psychology have evolved into looking at human intelligence and artificial intelligence and the amalgamation of two. So, cognitive psychology has come very far into the modern times towards understanding the comparison, the difference, and how similar human intelligence is to artificial intelligence, and towards understanding our capacity to efficiently process information, and how that tends to differ from artificial intelligence or that of computers. Yes, so that's a very brief idea of how cognitive psychology has come into existence, right? So, nonetheless, you all can definitely read up, and you'd find there's a lot of information that would help you understand that there is a lot that has gone by, and there's a lot that cognitive psychology as a school has evolved from. So, when we're trying to understand what exactly is cognitive psychology, it then becomes a very interdisciplinary kind of a science, because it has its roots in many areas, and it plays a role, or it draws from many other areas of psychology and science. Yes? Okay. Now that we have some idea of how cognitive psychology came into existence, let's move on to understanding what are the basic assumptions that lie within cognitive psychology. Now, if you look at the pointers that are mentioned here, most of them are very self explanatory, but nonetheless, let's go through them one by one. Alright, so the first one that you can see here reads, the mind can be studied scientifically. Yes, and what we're trying to say here is that although it's a process that isn't visibly noticeable, but it definitely can be studied through various research methods. Now, I will not be going into the various research methods that can be utilized to study the mind or behavior, because they will definitely be covered in the following sessions, or even in your session with research methodology and understanding the different kinds of research methods that are going into it. But nonetheless, even while we were looking at the progression in cognitive psychology, we came across how introspection is used, we came across how lab experiments were done. So basically what we're trying to say here is that although it's not completely noticeable by the naked eye, there are ways that they can be scientifically studied. Alright, moving on to the next point. being that information processing in humans resembles that in computers. And this is something that we just discussed when we were talking about the modern times in which cognitive psychology focuses on the difference or the comparison between how, as humans, we process information and how we're looking at artificial intelligence and their way of processing information. And we're trying to draw inferences and trying to understand how similar or how different, and if they are similar, then how can we make it much more efficient? All right. The third assumption that we're looking at is that human beings are information processors and mental processes guide behavior. All right. Now, there's two parts within this basic assumption. So the former being that human beings are information processors, that we have already stated in the second assumption. And the latter part of this third assumption is that mental processes guide behavior. And it works vice versa as well. So what we're trying to say here is that basically our behavior is governed by how we generally tend to process information. So the decisions that I make decide how I go about in terms of behavior, even something as simple as problem solving. So I'm using my mental processes, solving a problem, trying to find a solution to that problem, and then implementing that solution. And you'd find that even through behavior also has an effect on our mental processes. So let's say, for example, we're looking at problem solving and I've come up with a solution. And when I go to implement it, I realize that it doesn't work. So what happens is then, based on the new information that I have accumulated about the specific problem, I will go back and reconsider the solution to that problem. So it works vice versa as well, right? The next point being that cognitive processes are influenced by social and cultural factors, right? And that, I'm sure, is quite self-explanatory. But nonetheless, what we're trying to say here is that the social and cultural factors that we experience play a very important role in helping us process information, and they become our, in a certain way, if I could say, they guide the way, or they have an effect on how we process information, because we have certain rules and guidelines that we tend to follow as humans living in the society and within our own cultures. And with different cultures, you'd find that each culture tends to have a specific kind of influence on how we tend to process information, how we tend to perceive information, and so on, right? The last point being that cognitive processes interact with each other and with non-cognitive processes. Now, cognitive processes interacting with non-cognitive processes is what we just discussed in the previous assumption, that cognitive processes being influenced by social and cultural factors, right? Apart from just non-cognitive processes, the assumption here that looks at is that we also have cognitive processes interacting with each other. So something as simple as, let's say, attention and memory. My ability to pay attention to a certain kind of information and let's say pay selective attention to that information will decide how I store information. So when then I'm looking at storing of information either in the short-term memory or in the long-term memory, and then I'm also looking at how retrieval will happen. So if you look at this entire process, you'd notice that attention plays a very important role in memory, and through memory you're also looking at retrieval of information that plays an important role. So if either one of these processes is not done in the right manner that it should be done, which basically would mean that retrieval would be quite difficult, because if there is nothing stored, there is nothing to retrieve, right? So these would be the basic assumptions that come within cognitive psychology. Now, we have mainly covered, or we have mainly had a more deeper understanding of what cognitive psychology is. But nonetheless, let's just quickly glance through what are the domains that come within cognitive psychology, or the areas that come within cognitive psychology. There are many of them that I have already touched upon while we were discussing the basic assumptions and while we were discussing the progression of cognitive psychology and how psychology came into existence. So I won't really be going too much into most of them. So as you can see, the first one here is perception, then we have pattern recognition, then we have then we have attention, and then consciousness, then we have memory, then representation of knowledge, we have imagery, language, human development, thinking and concept formation, human and artificial intelligence, and cognitive neuroscience. Now, some are very basic and we've already discussed them, so I won't really be touching them, like for example perception, attention, consciousness, memory, imagery, language. All of these are factors that we've already discussed. Nonetheless, let's just go through them very briefly. So when we talk about perception, basically we're trying to understand our ability to detect and interpret stimuli and store it in a way that makes sense for us. And when you talk about pattern recognition, what we're saying is that the stimuli that's been presented to us, they might be in bits and pieces, but our ability to perceive it still helps us make sense of the bits and pieces as a whole, and then we interpret it as a whole as well. So what happens then is that we're able to make sense of any kind of pattern, whether it be in part or in whole, and we're able to store it in a way that makes sense only to us. The next point here is attention. This again we've discussed. So basically our ability to filter information that is relevant and ignore the one that is irrelevant basically helps us to focus our attention or focus our resources towards storing the information that we want, and that becomes a part of cognitive psychology. Now, when we talk about consciousness, we are talking about the idea of our current awareness, that is, the awareness that we have of the present stimuli in the environment and also of our internal circumstances. Yes. So when we are conscious, when we are aware, is when we are able to pay attention to any kind of stimuli and then store it in our memory. That's the next point. And I think most of you are well aware of the Atkinson-Shiffrin model that helps us understand the basic parts or stages in which memory storage happens. So we're talking about information that is selected, we have encoded it, we store it in the short-term memory, then rehearsal happens, and then it gets stored into long-term memory. And then after that, we're looking at if encoding has happened appropriately, we're looking at recall being facilitated. If there hasn't been any sort of encoding and storage that happens, then recall obviously would not be possible. Moving to the next point here, that is representation of knowledge. Now, when you talk about representation of knowledge, we're basically specifying the idea of how each information is conceptually stored for us individually, and it is very subjective in nature because all of us perceive information differently and all of us have our own personal experiences that we draw association from. So the representation of knowledge is going to be very subjective, very personal to us based on our own experiences. And you would also have the neural circuits that are going to be different for each of us. So based on our associations, based on our categories that we form, we are talking about subjective and personal categories that we make, and hence the neural circuit also being different for each one of us. Then we have imagery, and with imagery we're basically looking at our ability, again this is in reference to Tolman's cognitive map experiment, so our ability to create a mental image of information to help us store it more appropriately and then accordingly retrieve it. Yes. The next point here is language. Like we discussed earlier, we're talking about our ability to utilize information that we have stored in the form of communication. And when we talk about language, we don't necessarily mean only linguistic, we're also talking about both verbal and non-verbal language. So our focus here also is on the kind of gestures that we use, the body language, the posture that we tend to have, and all of these help us communicate the information that we want to someone else. Moving on, we're looking at human development. This is again the part where we spoke about how developmental psychology plays a role in cognitive psychology, and the sole reason being that with age or with time we change as humans, and with the changes that we go throughout our entire lifespan, it also has a role to play in the changes that it brings about in our cognition. So we always want to study how they interact with each other, and that's the reason why it comes under the domain of cognitive psychology. And then we have thinking and concept formation, which I touched upon while we were talking about how we categorize information that helps us form a concept. And these concepts are, it could be universal, but most often or not you'd realize that they tend to be personal because they are governed by some rule that we have formulated that helps us categorize information better, right? Then we're looking at human and artificial intelligence, which we've already touched upon, and we're looking at cognitive neuroscience as a domain where we are focusing on how the brain processes information, or how the processing of information has an effect on the neural circuits that we have and the effect that it has on our brain, and how we tend to utilize or draw upon those neural circuits whenever necessary or whenever we want to utilize that information. So we're looking at biology playing a role here as well when we talk about the domains of cognitive psychology. Yes, so now that we've looked at all the major domains of cognitive psychology and we have a clearer picture of what we think or what we've understood consists within cognitive psychology, I'd conclude with a basic summary of what exactly cognitive psychology is. Now, this is basically um, a summary of what we have already discussed in the previous slides. To conclude, this would give you a complete understanding of what we have understood about cognitive psychology. So it is an interdisciplinary science, like we discussed in the previous slides, and it's studied scientifically. So we looked at a few methods that are used to study. So we're saying that even though it's not uh, visible, not necessarily observable, but it can still be studied scientifically, whether be it through introspection, whether be it through laboratory experiments, whether be it through observation. Yes, and we're saying that the major focus here is on the mental processes that we tend to have and our ability to acquire or gain information about the world from the world, and how this information that we have gained can be stored and processed by the brain. Yes, so we're also looking at the storage of information, and then we're looking at how this information is transformed through processing, through assigning categories, through the assigning of meaning and associations, and this transformation facilitates storage. And eventually, we're looking at how this information that has been stored can be utilized to either solve problems, to help us make decisions, and also to help us communicate with other humans. Yes? So, that would be a basic summary of what is cognitive psychology. I hope you'll, at the end of this session, you'll have a clearer idea of what exactly is cognitive psychology and the important role that it plays in understanding human behavior. And if you all can see in the schedule that we have, it earlier was an introduction to cognitive and developmental psychology, but now it's divided. So today we'll be looking at only an introduction to cognitive psychology, and in the following session we'd look at an introduction to developmental psychology. Yes, so thank you for joining in on this session and have a nice day, and do let me know if you'll have any queries with regard to what was just discussed. Thank you.